This is a reading from the 4th chapter of 2 Corinthians. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. Many years ago, I was a pastor in a place with an office, which made me in charge of the office equipment, some of which was actually, it was pretty good office equipment, but as happens to office equipment, it malfunctions. And so I was the one with the most personal contact with the copier repairman. And fittingly, for a Quaker meeting, his name was Barclay. And Barclay had some really good stories about copiers and printers gone wrong. The one that I remember the best was the time that he came to the meeting house and he was telling me about the job that he had just had, and the collator on that copier wasn't working. His customer told him that when he opened the collator door to try and find the problem, a large mouse, 5 or 6 inches long, jumped out of the collator. And Barclay told me about all the stuff that mouse had brought into the collator and which Barclay had discovered and had to throw out. Bits of paper, packets of grape jelly, paper clips. In the process of storing all this treasure, the mouse had bitten through several of the wires that make the collator work. And that's why Barclay's customer was having problems with the machine. But Barclay himself was most impressed with the quantity of stuff that was hoarded inside the copier. And as I listened to this story, I became convinced that, in fact, it was not a mouse that had been in the copier, but it was a pack rat, also known as a wood rat, probably, given our location, the Allegheny wood rat, Neotoma magister. Now, I don't know how much, I expect you've had experience with pack rats of the rodent variety. I don't know how much. And in case you haven't, I just want to say that the pack rat is not at all like the urban Norway rat that we get so disgusted about. It doesn't live in colonies or sewers. It doesn't even really look like a rat. It looks more like a mouse. It has a bushy tail. It is not the carrier of any threatening diseases. Most of the time, it lives outdoors in wooded rock piles and cliffs. Occasionally, it comes into a building. It's mostly a solitary, peaceable critter that means us no harm. But I am a person who has lived with a pack rat, not just once in my life, but twice. And once you have lived with them, you cannot overlook their propensity for stealing things. I'll mention that that's not mentioned in Peterson's field guide. This is from life experience. The first time I lived with a pack rat was on a small farm in the Sandhills of Nebraska. My father and my stepmother, Mava, were keeping half a crop of sweet potatoes and a couple of bushels of apples in a root cellar beneath the house. My younger siblings were 7, 5, and 3, and my dad used to get pretty disturbed at them for the quantity of apples that they were eating. When they would tell him that they were not taking any apples without permission, he would get even more perturbed about how easy they found it to lie. All of this emotional disturbance occurred before the day that Mava went down the stairs of the root cellar and looked into the eyes of an extremely large mouse climbing out of a bushel basket with an entire apple in its mouth. It suddenly also became clear to her why she always had fewer sweet potatoes than she remembered having. Several years later, my family was back on our farm in Arkansas, and I moved in with them directly after graduating from college. At first, I lived in one of the outbuildings on the farm that had no electricity, but I would come and eat dinner with the family at night. And every so often, all gathered around the dinner table, we would hear a thumping noise from upstairs, even though no one was upstairs. It was an old creaky house and we didn't think very much of it. Sometimes, as we listened to the thumps, Maeva wondered whether we had a pack rat again. She was storing sweet potatoes in one of the two upstairs rooms, and every so often there were fewer than she remembered. But there was no proof that there was anything up there. There were only the occasional thumps. Eventually, the weather got a lot colder and I had to leave my unheated cabin, and I moved into one of the upstairs rooms, the one without the sweet potatoes. Almost every night, I woke up in the dark thinking that someone was walking around in the room next to me. It was a little frightening at first, but I accepted the pack rat theory. And so I would just make sure to close the door between the two rooms, even though that door did not latch, but I would close it and hope that friction would hold it shut. And I would hope that this creature that I had never seen was not large enough to push the door open. And then I'd go back to sleep. Occasionally in the family, we would make jokes about how I ought to be wearing my boots in bed, just in case. But really, as long as I could contain my fears about whatever was moving around in the next room, and as long as I made sure that the door was closed, the pack rat was an undemanding roommate as far as I was concerned. I went away for a week at Thanksgiving. When I came back, 1/4 of the blanket on my bed had been eaten away, leaving a ragged, bitten edge. We're talking an area this big in my blanket had suddenly disappeared. No trace. And even more, there were nibble marks on my boots. So much for thinking that my boots would protect me in bed. Eventually, my stepmother Maeva trapped the pack rat under a wash basin and released it 1/4 mile from the house. As far as any of us know, it never found its way back. So maybe because I've lived with one, the pack rat has always been kind of fascinating to me. In the wild, it makes its home mostly from sticks and leaves and other kinds of rubble, but even there, bright, shiny objects and oddities are tucked away into the walls. In fact, these heaps of rubble that the pack rat collects out in the woods are called middens. And archaeologists love to find pack rat middens because they are some of the best evidence we have of the life of the Native Americans before the arrival of European colonists. I will not tell you in what way the pack rat preserves everything that's in the midden because it's kind of disgusting, but everything in the midden is extremely well preserved down to the seeds. And so archaeologists can tear apart a pack rat midden and figure out what Native Americans were eating, what they were planting, what their pottery looked like, their incredible treasure trove of Native American life, because the pack rat likes to take bright, shiny objects. I mean, when I think about the things that pack rat takes, they fall kind of into two categories. I understand the sweet potatoes. I understand the apples. I even understand taking 1/4 of my blanket. But why the paper clips? Why the coins and the pieces of broken glass and the buttons and the silverware and all the other things that pack rats have been known to take, including the occasional stick of dynamite? Why those things? And then I come back to this passage from Paul about this treasure that we have in jars of clay. the light shining in our hearts, God's light shining in our hearts, a treasure that we have in jars of clay. And those two things, they kind of work together for me, this idea of this treasure in our hearts and this idea of the pack rat midden. And I just get this sense of cozy nestedness. And I ask myself, what treasure am I keeping in the midden of my heart, in a way? I think about being a kid and lying under the covers at night with a flashlight and either reading, which is probably the thing I did most often. There's nothing quite so pleasurable as stealing reading time, even if you're stealing it from yourself. And then also using the flashlight to look at all the other little treasures I might have found during the day, the shiny rock that I had, or one thing that I dug up out of the front yard was a decoder disc that you could use. It had an alphabet code on it, and I would look at that. I never wrote a message with it really, but I just loved to twirl it around and see what hidden messages I could have written. And when you think about all these things, the number one treasure, the first treasure was the flashlight, because without the flashlight, you couldn't see the rest of it. And I think about how that flashlight of God's light illuminates the treasures of our hearts and the things in our hearts that are possibly not treasure, like abandoned paper clips. The treasure of God's light can show us what belongs in our heart and what maybe doesn't belong in our heart. And a couple weeks ago, in her message, Patricia talked about one of our Wilmington yearly meeting queries. And as I think about it, I think the queries are a part of our Quaker tradition that I would like to store as one of the treasures of my heart. Because the queries take my flashlight, my kind of torch of God, and put a lens on it so that I can see the other things in my heart. They focus the light so that I can examine the glittering spoons here and the rusted bottle caps there and show me what's in it. The queries are a treasure for the heart, and I think they are one of the best treasures that friends possess. So I'd like to read a few of our Wilmington yearly meeting queries, because I think it will become obvious how they can become a part of the treasure of our heart. Do I live in thankful awareness of God's constant presence in my life? What steps am I taking to be sensitive and obedient to the leading of the Holy Spirit? Do I engage in regular prayer for myself and others? Knowing that we are all ministers, am I open and obedient to God's promptings to speak? Do I thoughtfully consider the differing viewpoints of others as an opportunity for deeper understanding within the Christian fellowship? Do I prayerfully consider how to spend my time, energy, and money? Do I have a clear vision of what living in the manner of friends means in our world today? I continue to think and meditate on and contemplate the difference I began to explore this summer between a monastic life of kind of single-minded devotion and intense devotion to the love of God and God's love alone, and a more, what we might call, secular worldly faith, which is devoted to God but finds its expression in many avenues of the world. And I think the thing about the queries is they are for secular and worldly living. They help us maintain our focus on God when God is not our only focus. They are a means by which we can live in the world but maintain God as the treasure of our hearts. Having said all that, it was a disappointment to discover that our queries are not actually on our website. And while our faith and practice is on our website, our queries that were approved in 2004, 2005, and should have replaced the queries in the faith and practice have not replaced the queries in the faith and practice. So we have the old queries in the faith and practice. And I'm going to see if I can remedy that, and I hope that you will all hold me accountable for making sure that these 2004, 2005 queries get on our website, because I think they really are our treasure, and for each of us individually and for the yearly meeting as a whole, we have a wonderful instrument of faith that we can use to keep our secular lives in tune with God's leadings, and I hope that we will make more use of them.